So the Big Bang is interesting, but maybe a more interesting question is what happened before the Big Bang. There are two possibilities, is that what consists of our universe existed forever, or you have something created out of nothing, which both of them seem really ridiculous ideas. To think of, what do you mean it was forever? Like, you mean something it had to have a beginning, right? Like, so that doesn't make any sense. But having something created from nothing doesn't really make any sense either.
The legend of the Jews, as told in the Torah, is that God decided to create the universe, beginning with light, through speech. And God goes through a series of days of the week, and that's how we have 7 days according to Judaism, in which God chose to create different things in order. Land and water were separated, light and darkness formed, and then ending with Shabbat, the 7th day of the week, in which God rested and decided for it to be holy.
So the scholars that I know and theologians that I know now would look at Genesis and say Genesis isn't a scientific account of the world. Genesis is an account of the goodness of creation. And so the significant thing about Genesis isn't that something supposedly happened on one day and something happened on another, or that at the end of each day, God determined that it was good.
How did the universe begin? The Big Bang Theory. It is, well, it's better understood now than it was when I started studying physics, but it is still a work in progress.
So what was observed, and this took a lot of interesting science about really trying to figure out distances, how far everything was and how fast everything was moving. But it seems like, and it's pretty non-controversial in the academic world, that everything is expanding from everything else. And so the current theory is that everything began with a Big Bang, which of pure energy, and then once it cooled down, that energy could turn into mass via E equals mc squared, and that's how our universe began.
He assembled the idea out of a logic and a lot of evidence. Darwin was not like a philosopher, he was a practicing biologist. He bred plants, he was a very, very careful observer of the world, and that's really where the theory of natural selection comes from.
He was bound to be a clergyman, didn't like that, and was trained as a naturalist and accepted a position on the voyage of a ship called the Beagle, which went around the world.
What strikes him is that there's this chain of islands in the Galapagos, and it really, really looks like everything is incredibly well suited to its particular habitat, where it is. So one of the famous examples he went through are the finches, so these little birds, and Darwin, being a very careful observer, starts to look at their beaks and their diets. And what he notices is even from one island to like a small distance away, there are these tiny differences in the shapes and structures of the beaks. And then he'd watch them eat and say like, oh my God, this beak on this island is like perfect for the particular food they eat that's only on this island. And on this other island over here, there's this other type of beak that's a tiny bit different, and it's perfect for that.
Fundamentally there, the advance is a major advance in science in terms of recognizing pattern, and then turning this recognition of pattern into a theory. And the sort of the short answer, what is evolution, is this step-by-step progression of change and traits over time.
At the time, the prevailing wisdom, in the Western, especially like European and American world, is that God created human beings exactly as we are now, something like 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. And Darwin sits on the idea really largely because he is worried about everybody freaking out.
He was afraid of a religious backlash. He was also a very careful scientist and didn't want to publish anything that was not thoroughly thought through and written about. And it wasn't until he heard that another person, Alfred Wallace, was going to publish a theory on evolution that he rushed it actually to print.
The Christians and Jews I know read the book of Genesis now differently than our forebears would have 150 years ago, partly because of Darwin, partly because our understanding of ourselves as human animals, as part of an emerging biosphere, changes the way in which we understand things, our sense that how recent the Bible is, how recently it was written down, apparent contradictions within it, which might actually need to be understood in terms of deeper intentions.
We've gotten very good at understanding what we don't understand about the universe. We've identified ordinary matter, and that's about 4 or 5% of the whole universe, and the other 95% of the universe is, we put these labels on it, we call it dark matter and dark energy, and then we shrug and we're saying, well, we don't know what these things are, that's why they're dark. What we observe from dark energy and dark matter is precious little. We have a slightly better handle on what dark matter may be.
It's just non-radiating stuff. It's some stuff we can't see, and so it could be a lot of protons or neutrons that are just not hot enough.
Galaxies have a very distinctive structure. Most of them have this beautiful spiral shape with these arms that form, these brighter arms that form, and the whole thing is rotating. Most galaxies contain a supermassive black hole at their center, and even that is not enough to account for the structure that we see. If we try to model on a computer the formation of a galaxy based on the stuff that we can observe, it never works out right. So you add this X factor, the dark matter, and then the structure comes out right.
My father's a scientist. He's a nuclear engineer. He seems a bit more disturbed by dark matter than I am. And I think that's probably because he's a scientist and has some sense of what that means. To me, it sounds kind of like, well, religious traditions have been talking about dark matter for a really long time. Whether it's the hidden aspect of God, whether it is the yin and the yang, whether it is the depths of time in Indian tradition, whether it's, it's like dark matter, yeah, unknown things, yeah, that's why we need religion.
Dark energy is the real unknown. We have evidence that it's there because the expansion of the universe can't be happening the way that we're observing it happening now if there weren't some sort of energy driving it.
The universe is accelerating, and yet we have no mechanism for that. It's possible that these things are real. It's possible that these things are a result of an incorrect theory.
The fact remains that something like, 19 out of 20 knowable things we probably don't know. So that presents us with a conundrum. Like, what do you do if you don't know things? And I think that's kind of a good question for any human being to ask themselves.
I don't see how religion can fill those gaps. I do think that people find meaning in narratives that feel like they make sense. I don't find meaning in narratives that just feel like they make sense. I find meaning in narratives that have evidence because that's how they make sense to me. If there is something that science cannot understand yet, which is kind of the hubris of science, that eventually we'll be able to understand everything. It's a slow outward expansion of knowledge over time. And so 100,000 years from now, if humans are still on the same enterprise, then we'll know a lot more, right? That's the idea. That's what we think science can do. So I'm content to wait.
Well, I think there's a dichotomy between science and religion, in that science seeks to understand how things work. The science can, through physics, through chemistry, explain what is happening and even how it's happening. Religion, as I understand it, doesn't answer those questions per se, but rather tries to answer the question, well, why? Why even have a universe? Or what is our purpose in this universe? Those are questions that science has, I think, no real interest in.
And then that's where it gets back to ethics and morality. I think those are the questions that religion is very well suited to address. Science, not so much.
Religion is about living with discomfort. Depending whether you are, what kind of religious person you are, it might be the discomfort of being created, which is a very uncomfortable thing. That you didn't make yourself up, that you didn't get to decide what it means to be human, that you didn't decide that you were going to be human.
I'm a scientist. I guess maybe first and foremost, not like I was born a scientist, but I certainly see the world through the view of what I can observe. I can't necessarily observe God, but I've had spiritual experiences. I see myself as someone who can or does sometimes see the world in more of a spiritual way, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I believe in, and here I'm going to characterize it in a particular way, in a God, a single God, who, for example, created the world. So I was a very active member of the church. So when I traveled, my first trip being to Chennai, India, and experienced poverty in a way I'd never seen it before, even though we grew up below the poverty line and everybody knew was on food stamps. It wasn't like what I saw in India. And experiencing that level of deep suffering and humanity changed the way I thought about God.
I don't have evidence that God doesn't exist, but I don't know what evidence would look like that anything doesn't exist.
I'm open to the idea that God exists, but my rational mind says I need to see some proof or evidence before I can make that leap of faith.
I guess I don't feel like there are holes in my life that I need to believe in God to fill, if that makes sense.
It's nice to think, to conceptualize of something that's bigger and that's created everything. And for me, it's comforting and also helpful to think from that perspective.
I think religion can be an important factor for many people. I think that one can be spiritual and not be religious. Spiritual meaning that you believe in emotion and passion and a belief structure.
When I was your age, I thought I had a really smart answer to that question, which was, well, who cares what I believe? God either exists or doesn't. And I still think that's true. I still think there's something very odd in the question. When people say, do you believe in God? It's always concealing a different question. When evangelical Christians ask it, it's like, are you saved or are you going to hell? In some other settings, it's kind of like, are you really credulous? Are you? As a religious studies scholar, I encounter it a lot. I guess I would say that I can't imagine reality without God. My own conceptions of it or conceptualizations of it have changed enough that I wouldn't want to say that what I believe now is true. My study of and encounter with other religious traditions and non-religious traditions as well has often enough confronted me with something that seemed real as well. So I'm suspicious of any tradition that thinks it has the full and final account of reality, but I do think that religious language, religious ritual are necessary parts of engaging full reality.
The Torah does not describe the end of days at all. It's worth noting that for Jews, the 5 books of the Torah are paramount. They tell the story of how we went from being people like Adam, Eve, to being a people, the people of Israel, the Jewish people. Those 5 books, though, are not the end of the story of the Jewish people. Those 5 books are perhaps chapter 1, or 2, 3, 4, and 5. The next series of texts, what we call the Tanakh, or the Hebrew Bible, include prophets and include other types of literature that include ideas about the end of days. Some ideas about that end of days period is not about the world coming to an end, but the world order that they were exhibiting or observing coming to an end. So one idea that's put forward is by Isaiah that one day war will not be taught. Thinking about the world order right now, and also 2,000 years ago, there were feuding factions, feuding nations. Injustice prevailed. And so Isaiah and other prophets imagined a world order in which those situations or realities would be turned on their heads.
Well, I guess there'll be a final judgment and a great battle. But again, just the way you can look at these origin stories and say, well, it isn't actually telling you the way things happened. It's telling you a story that's important for knowing how we should be here and now. I think ending stories tell you how to be here now.
There are essentially three outcomes to how will the universe end. One of the ways is, if the universe is expanding, we understand that the gravitational force tends to pull things back together again. So that's where the key to understanding the eventual outcome lies. Possibility is called the steady state, that it expands and then stops. And it just kind of reaches this equilibrium point where it's neither expanding nor contracting. The other possibility is that it just keeps expanding and getting colder and colder along the way. High energy photons getting lower and lower energy as it goes.
The depth of time in Indian traditions is vast. So I'm more familiar with the Buddhist versions of it, which build on the Indian ones, since Buddhism started as an Indian religion. There's a sense that the world is created, it emerges by a series of mostly accidents, and you enter a long period in which there's a great deal of suffering and nobody knows what to do about it. Then the Dharma, the saving teaching of the Buddhas, arises from some being that has been through enough lives of rebirth and purification to be able to understand them. It was the reality that has always been so, but that human beings and other beings could not understand. It took an enlightened being to see what was there. The enlightened being shared it with others, and then you enter a period in which the Dharma can be preached and understood. That period is over. Then comes a period in which the Dharma can be preached and not understood. That's the one we're in. After that will come a period in which the Dharma can neither be preached nor understood. Everything returns to chaos. And eventually the whole thing will begin again, and a completely different set of characters, totally different universe. The same Dharma will be taught by an enlightened being.
If gravity is stronger, then the expansion will slow down and stop and reverse itself, and then instead of a big bang, that could lead us to the big crunch, as it's been called. Like everything kind of returns to that state that it was at the Big Bang. And this kind of leads into the idea also that you could have an oscillating universe where it expands and then crunches and expands and crunches.
So there's in some way, tremendous pessimism in that view, or maybe there's a tremendous hope, kind of a sense that looks like things are going to hell, because they are. But that's not the end of the story.